Once again, Barry gives the incredible. Number one.
Hello guys, how are you? Welcome to the stream. Hello everybody and hello nobody. Since I don't know if anybody's watching, I will not check, but nevertheless or nonetheless or however should we say it, we will do a book reading stream tonight. It will be a bit different, a little bit chill, I hope. We will be reading a book called The Ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It will be interesting because I have not read a book for a really long time, and I will do this because I need to improve my English, so improve my pronunciations, reading and stuff like that. I want to talk English, I want to speak English better, actually, not talk, sorry. Yeah, that's mostly it. And I didn't read a book for a while, and for a while means like I don't know, I can't remember I think the last thing I read was something like Harry Potter in high school. So yeah, don't judge me. I think I'm not worse than others regarding that. Hopefully, we will be. Like I said, reading the book by Douglas Adams. It is here. You see it. I will now switch to the book reading scene. I hope this is okay for you. I have another one, but unfortunately I don't have a camera that would look directly in the book so you could read with me. Also, I don't know if this music is maybe a tad bit too loud. I will lower it a bit. This should do it. Let me check. Okay, so we have around how much? Let me first put out this marker because we will need to place it where we stop. Also, the book has how many pages? Around 800. So we'll see how many streams will I do this. We'll see if how long will I do it per stream. We'll see if I will give up after some time. So yeah, I will have to try to talk a little bit slower, clearer, louder, and yeah, hope you enjoyed the book with me, and sorry for my Balkan accent. So yeah, that's what we're trying to improve. So let me just check if my table is at the lowest position. It is, it's okay, so it's my chair, yep. Let me sit nicely. That's mostly it. I have some water here, I mean Cedevita. I don't know if this music has words. If it has, we will switch it later, because I don't think words go with book reading, right? So yeah, I think that we will begin, and we'll see when someone joins us or something. So the content of the book is, first we have an introduction, a guide to the guide. Then we have the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is the first part. The restaurant at the end of the universe, which is at 145. Life, the universe and everything is the next chapter. So then we have So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. That's from the starting song. I watched the film, but I didn't read the book. Then we had Young Zephod Plays It Safe and Mostly Harmless. So like I said, around 800 pages. I hope I can do this. Here we go. Introduction. A guide to the guide. Some unhelpful remarks from the author. The history of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is now so complicated that every time I tell it, I contradict myself, and whenever I do get it right, I misquoted. So the publication of this omnibus edition seemed like a good opportunity to set the record straight, or at least firmly crooked. Anything that is put down wrong here is, as far as I'm concerned, wrong for good. The idea for the title first cropped up while I was lying drunk in a field in Innsbruck, Austria in 1971. Not particularly drunk, just the sort of drunk you get when you have a couple of stiff guessers after not having eaten for 2 days straight, on account of being a penniless hitchhiker. We are talking of a mild inability to stand up. I was traveling with a copy of the Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe by Ken Walsh, a very battered copy that I had borrowed from someone. In fact, since this was 1971 and I still have the book, it must count as stolen by now. I didn't have a copy of Europe on $5 a day, as it then was, because I wasn't in that financial league. Night was beginning to fall on my field as it spun lazily underneath me. I was wondering where I could go that was cheaper than Innsbruck, revolved less and didn't do the sort of things to me that Innsbruck had done to me that afternoon. What had happened was this. I had been walking through the town trying to find a particular address, and being thoroughly lost, I stopped to ask for directions from a man in the street. I knew this mightn't be easy, because I don't speak German, but I was still surprised to discover just how much difficulty I was having communicating with this particular man. Gradually, the truth dawned on me as we struggled in vain to understand each other that of all the people in Innsbruck I could have stopped to ask, the one I had picked did not speak English, did not speak French, and was also deaf and dumb. With a series of sincerely apologetic hand movements, I disentangled myself, and a few minutes later, on another street, I stopped and asked another man who also turned out to be deaf and dumb, which was when I bought the beers. I ventured back onto the street. I tried again. When the third man I spoke to turned out to be deaf and dumb also... Sorry, let me try that again. When the third man I spoke to turned out to be deaf and dumb, and also blind, I began to feel a terrible weight settling on my shoulders. Wherever I looked, the trees and buildings took on dark and menacing aspects. I pulled my coat tightly around me and hurried lurching down the street, whipped by a sudden gusting wind. I bumped into someone and stammered an apology, but he was deaf and dumb and unable to understand me. The sky lowered. I don't know what lowered is. The pavement seemed to tip and spin. If I hadn't happened then to duck down a side street and pass a hotel where a convention for the deaf was being held, there is every chance that my mind would have cracked completely and I would have spent the rest of my life writing the sort of books for which Kafka became famous and dribbling. As it is, I went to lie in a field, along with my Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe. And when the stars came out, it occurred to me that if only someone would write a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as well, then I, for one, would be off like a shot. Having had this thought, I promptly fell asleep and forgot about it for 6 years. I went to Cambridge University. I took a number of baths and a degree in English. I worried a lot about girls and what had happened to my bike. Later I became a writer and worked on a lot of things that were almost incredibly successful, but in fact just failed to see the light of day. Other writers will know what I mean. My pet project was to write something that would combine comedy and science fiction, and it was this obsession that drove me into deep depth and despair. No one was interested, except finally one man, a BBC radio producer named Simon Brett, who had the same idea, comedy and science fiction. Although Simon only produced the first episode before leaving the BBC to concentrate on his own writing, he is best known in the United States for his excellent Charles Perry detective novels. Never heard. I owe him an immense debt of gratitude for simply getting the thing to happen in the first place. He was succeeded by the legendary Jeffrey Perkins. In its original form, the show was going to be rather different. I was feeling a little disgruntled with the world at the time and had put together about 6 different plots, each of which ended with the destruction of the world in a different way, and for a different reason. It was to be called The Ends of the Earth. Sorry. While I was filling in the details of the first plot, in which the Earth was demolished to make way for a new hyperspace express route, I realized that I needed to have someone from another planet around to tell the reader what was going on, to give the story the context it needed. So I had to work out who he was and what he was doing on the Earth. I decided to call him Ford Perfect. This was a joke that missed American audiences entirely, of course, since they had never heard of the rather oddly named little car, and many thought it was typing error for perfect. Oh, it is for prefect. I even read it wrong. Retard. Sorry. I explained in the text that the minimal research my alien character had done before arriving on this planet had led him to think that this name would be nicely inconspicuous. He had simply mistaken the dominant life form. So how would such a mistake arise? I remembered when I used to hitchhike through Europe and would often find that the information or advice that came my way was out of date or misleading in some way. Most of it, of course, just came from stories of other people's travel experiences. At that point, the title Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy suddenly popped back into my mind from wherever it had been hiding all this time. Ford, I decided, would be a researcher who collected data for the guide. As soon as I started to develop this particular notion, it moved It moved inexorably to the center of the story, and the rest, as the creator of the original Ford prefect would say, is bunk. The story grew in the most convoluted way, as many people will be surprised to learn. Writing episodically meant that when I finished one episode, I had no idea about what the next one would contain. When in the twists and turns of the plot, some event suddenly seemed to illuminate things that had gone before. I was surprised as anyone else. I think that the BBC attitude towards the show while it was in production was very similar to that which Macbeth had toward murdering people. Initial doubts, followed by cautious enthusiasm, and then greater and greater alarm at the sheer scale of the undertaking and still no end in sight. Reports that Jeffrey and the sound engineers were buried in a subterranean studio for weeks on end, taking as long to produce a single sound effect as other people took to produce an entire series, and stealing everyone else's studio time in which to do so, we were all vigorously denied, but absolutely true. The budget of the series escalated to the point that it could have practically paid for a few seconds of Dallas if the show hadn't worked. The first episode went out on BBC Radio 4 at 10:30 p.m. on Wednesday, March 8, 1978. In a huge blaze of no publicity at all. Bats heard it, the odd dogs bark. After a couple of weeks, a letter or two trickled in. So, someone out there had listened. People I talked to seemed to like Marvin the paranoid android, whom I had written in as a one-scene joke and had only developed further at Jeffrey's insistence. Then some publishers became interested, and I was commissioned by Pen Books in England to write the series in book form. After a lot of procrastination and hiding and inventing excuses and having baths, I managed to get about 2/3 of it done. At this point they said very pleasantly and politely that I had already passed 10 deadlines, so would I please just finish the page I was on and let them have the damn thing. Meanwhile, I was busy trying to write another series and was also writing and script editing the TV series Doctor Who, because while it was all very pleasant to have your own radio series, especially one that somebody had written in to say they had heard, it didn't exactly buy you lunch. Give me a second. So that was more or less the situation when the book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, was published in England in September 1979 and appeared on the Sunday Times mass market bestseller list at number 1 and just stayed there. Clearly, somebody had been listening. This is where things start getting complicated, and this is what I was asked in writing this introduction to explain. The guy has appeared in so many forms: books, radio, television series, records, and soon to be a major motion picture, each time with a different storyline that even its most acute followers have become baffled at times. Here then is a breakdown of the different versions, not including the various stage versions which haven't been seen in the States and only complicate the matters further. The radio series began in England in March 1978. The first series consisted of 6 programs, or FITs as they were called. FITs 1 through 6, easy. Later that year, one more episode was recorded and broadcast, commonly known as the Christmas episode. It contained no reference of any kind to Christmas. It was called the Christmas episode because it was the first broadcast on December 24th, which is not Christmas Day. After this, things began to get increasingly complicated. In the fall of 1979, the first Hitchhiker book was published in England, called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It was a substantially expanded version of the first 4 episodes of the radio series, in which some of the characters behaved in entirely different ways and others behaved in exactly the same ways but for entirely different reasons, which amounts to the same thing but saves rewriting the dialogue. At roughly the same time, a double record album was released, which was by contrast a slightly contracted version of the first 4 episodes of the radio series. These were not the recordings that were originally broadcast, but wholly new recordings of substantially the same scripts. This was done because we had used music of gramophone records as incidental music for the series, which is fine on radio but makes commercial release impossible. In January 1980, 5 new episodes of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy were broadcast on BBC Radio, all in 1 week, bringing the total number to 12 episodes. In the fall of 1980, the second Hitchhiker book was published in England. Around the same time, Harmony Books published the first book in the United States. It was a very substantially reworked, re-edited and contracted versions of episodes 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 5 and 6. In that order. Wow. Of the radio series The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In case that seemed too straightforward, the book was called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, because it included the material from Radio episode 5 of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was set in a restaurant called Millway's, otherwise known as The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. At roughly the same time, a second record album was made featuring a heavily rewritten and expanded version of episode 5 and 6 of the radio series. This recorded album was also The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Meanwhile, a series of 6 television episodes of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was made by the BBC and broadcast in January 1981, so like half a year later. This was based more or less on the first 6 episodes of the radio series. In other words, it incorporated most of the book The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the second half of the book The Restaurant of the End of the Universe. Therefore, though it followed the basic structure of the End of the Universe, Therefore, though it followed the basic structure of the radio series, it incorporated revisions from the books, which didn't. In January 1982, Harmony Books published The Restaurant at the End of the Universe in the United States. In the summer of 1982, same year, a third Hitchhiker book was published simultaneously in England and the US, called Life, the Universe and Everything. This was not based on anything that had already been heard or seen on radio or television. In fact, it flatly contradicted episodes 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12 of the radio series. These episodes of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you will remember, had already been incorporated in revised form in the book called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. At this point, I went to America to write a film screenplay, which was completely inconsistent with most of what has gone on so far, and since that film was then delayed in the making, a rumor currently has it that filming will start shortly before the last Trump, I wrote a fourth and last book in the trilogy. So long and thanks for all the fish. This was published in Britain and the USA in the fall of 1984, and it effectively contradicted everything to date up to and including itself. As if this all were not enough, I wrote a computer game for Infocom called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which bore only fleeting resemblances to anything that had previously gone under the title, and in collaboration with Jeffrey Perkins assembled The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the original radio scripts, published in England and the USA in 1985. Now, this was an interesting venture. The book is, as the title suggests, a collection of all the radio scripts as broadcast, and it is therefore the only example of one Hitchhiker publication accurately and consistently reflecting another. I feel a little uncomfortable with this, which is why the introduction to that book was written after the final and definitive one you are now reading, and of course flatly contradicts it. People often ask me how they can leave the planet, so I have prepared some brief notes. How to leave the planet. 1. Phone NASA, NASA, I'm a retard, sorry. Phone NASA. Their number is 7134, okay, never mind. Explain that it's very important that you get away as soon as possible. Number 2, if they do not cooperate, phone any friend you may have in the White House to have a word on your behalf with the guys at the NASA. At NASA. If you don't have any friends in the White House, phone the Kremlin, ask the overseas operator for, and then a number. They don't have any friends there either, at least none to speak of, but they do seem to have a little influence, so you may as well try. If that also fails, phone the Pope for guidance. His telephone number is, and I gather his switchboard is infallible. Не погрешила. If number 5, if all these attempts fail, flag down a passing flying saucer and explain that it's vitally important you get away before your phone bill arrives. Los Angeles 1993 and London 1985-1986. Douglas Adams. Wow, this was actually pretty long. Long but fun and informative. So here we have, oh, you can see the picture, right? Maybe I can do this, wait. So this is the first part. For Johnny, I hope I read it correctly because it's Jonny. Johnny Brock and Claire Gorst and all other Arlingtonians for tea, sympathy and the sofa. Okay. Give me like a couple of minutes for a short break. This is also a prelude and then we have the first chapter. We'll see how much chapters we'll read and how big are they. Let me take a glance. Okay, not big, so maybe only the second chapter. The first. Okay, the chapters are relatively short, so we'll probably take some breaks. Because, sorry, but it's really hot here and I need to drink water and do something, so just a second. Okay, I'm back. We will continue now. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 98 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole, it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of the people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they all make a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place. And some said that even the trees had been a bad move and that no one should ever have left the oceans. And then one Thursday, nearly 2000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right. It would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone about it, a terrible stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story. But it is the story of that terrible, stupid catastrophe and some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not an Earth book, never published on Earth until the terrible catastrophe occurred, never seen or even heard of by an Earthman. Nevertheless, a wholly remarkable book. In fact, It was probably the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing corporation of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had ever heard of either. Not only is it a wholly remarkable book, it is also a highly successful one, more popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 53 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Ulun Kulpit's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters. Goddamn. Where God went wrong, some more of God's greatest mistake, and who is the God person anyway? So that's the books. In many of the more relaxed civilizations on the outer eastern rim of the galaxy, the Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplanted the great Encyclopedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom, for though it has many omissions and contains much that is appreciable, or at least widely inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and second, it has the words Don Penning inscribed in large friendly letters on its cover. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how these consequences are inextricably intertwined with this remarkable book begins very simply. It begins with a house. Chapter 1. The house stood on a slight rise just on the edge of the village. It stood in its own and looked out over a broad spread of West Country farmland. Not a remarkable house by any means, it was about 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of bricks, and had 4 windows set in the front of a size and proportion which more or less exactly failed to please the eye. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent. And that was only because it happened to be the one he lived in. He had lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London because it made him nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was looking so worried about. He worked in local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought. It was too, most of his friends worked in advertising. On Wednesday night it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, but the Thursday morning sun was bright and clear, as it shone on Arthur's then house for what was to be the last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur that the council wanted to knock it down and build a bypass instead. So yeah, highway. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered blearily around his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, so scrub. Shaving mirror pointing at the ceiling, he adjusted it. For a moment it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee, yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect to it. The bulldozer outside the kitchen windows was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water and another. He began... Oh, there is a comma. I need to start using commas. So, let's try that again. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water. And another. He began to suspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped onto the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pub, he thought. Oh dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry. Angry about something that seemed important. He'd been telling people about it, telling people about it at great length. He rather suspected. His clearest visual recollection was of glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about a new bypass he just found out about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known about it. Ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out, he decided. No one wanted a bypass, the council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover it had on him though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow. He thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something to connect with. 15 seconds later, he was out of the house and lying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Mr. L. Processor was, as they say, only human. In other words, he was a carbon-based bipedal life form descended from an ape. More specifically, he was 40, fat and shabby and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, thought he didn't know. He was also a direct male line descendant of Genghis Khan, though intervening generations and racial mixing had so juggled his genes that he had no discernible mongoloid characteristics, and the only vestiges left in Mr. L. Prosir of his mighty ancestry was a pronounced stoutness about the thumb and predilection for little fur hats. He was by no means a great warrior. In fact, he was a nervous, worried man. Today he was particularly nervous and worried because something had gone seriously wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur Dent's house got cleared out of the way before the day was out. Not good. Come off it, Mr. Dent, he said. You can't win, you know. You can't lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely. He tried to make his eyes blaze fiercely, but they just wouldn't do it. Arthur lay in the mud and squelched at him. I'm game, he said. We'll see who runs first. I'm afraid you're going to have to accept it, said Mr. Prosser, gripping his fur hat and rolling it around the top of his head. This bypass has got to be built, and it's going to be built. First I've heard of it, said Arthur. Why is it going to be built? Mr. Prosser shook his finger at him for a bit, then stopped and put it away again. What do you mean, why it's got to be built? He said. It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses. Bypasses are devices that allow some people to dash from point A to point B very fast, while other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly in between, are often given to wonder what's so great about point A that so many people from point B are so keen to get there. And what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are so keen to get there. They often wish the people would just once and for all work out where the hell they wanted to be. Mr. Prosser wanted to be at point D. Point D wasn't anywhere in particular, it was just any convenient point a very long way from points A, B and C. He would have a nice little cottage at point D, with X's over the door, and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the door. Which would be the nearest pub to point D, sorry. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted X's. He didn't know why, he just liked X's, probably the Genghis Khan. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, but it was equally uncomfortable at each. Obviously somebody had been appallingly incompetent, and he hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Prosser said, You were quite entitled to make any suggestions or protest at the appropriate time, you know. Appropriate time? Hooted Arthur. Appropriate time? The first I knew about it was when a workman arrived at my house yesterday. I asked him if he had come to clean the windows, and he said no, he'd come to demolish the house. He didn't tell me straight away, of course. Oh no. First he wiped a couple of windows and charged me a $5. Then he told me. But Mr. Dent, the plans have been available in the local planning office for the last 9 months. Oh yes, well, as soon as I heard, I went straight round to see them. Yesterday afternoon. You hadn't exactly gone out of your way to call attention to them, had you? I mean, like actually telling anybody or anything. But the plans are on display. On display? I eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them. That's the display department, with a flashlight. Oh well, the lights had probably gone. So had the stairs. But look, you found the notice, didn't you? Yes, said Arthur. Yes, I did. It was on display in the bottom of a locked filing cabinet stuck in a disused lavatory with a sign on the door saying, Beware of the leopard. A, a cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent as he lay propped up on his elbow in the cold mud. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Prosser frowned at it. It's not as if it's a particularly nice house, he said. I'm sorry, but I happen to like it. You'll like the bypass. Oh, shut up, said Arthur Dent. Shut up and go away, and take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got a leg to stand on, and you know it. Mr. Prosser's mouth opened and closed a couple of times, while his mind was for a moment filled with inexplicable but terribly attractive visions of Arthur Dent's house being consumed with fire, and Arthur himself running screaming from the blazing ruin with at least 3 hefty spears protruding from his back. Mr. Prosser was often bothered with visions like these, and they made him feel very nervous. He stuttered for a moment and then pulled himself together. Mr. Dent, he said. Hello, yes, said Arthur. Some factual information for you. Have you any idea how much damage that bulldozer would suffer if I just let it roll straight over you? How much, said Arthur. None at all, said Mr. Prosser, and stormed nervously off, wondering why his brain was filled with 1,000 hairy horsemen all shouting at him. Fucking Genghis Khan. By a curious coincidence, none at all is exactly how much suspicion the ape descendant Arthur Dent had that one of his closest friends was not descended from an ape, but was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse and not from Guildford as he usually claimed. Arthur Dent had never ever suspected this. This friend of his had first arrived on the planet Earth some 15 Earth years ago, and some 15 Earth years previously, and he had worked hard to blend himself into Earth society with, it must be said, some success. For instance, he had spent those 15 years pretending to be an out-of-work actor, which was plausible enough. He had made one careless blunder though, because he had skimmed a bit on his preparatory research. The information he had gathered had led him to choose the name Ford Prefect as being nicely inconspicuous. He was not conspicuously tall, his features were striking but not conspicuously handsome, his hair was wiry and gingerish and brushed backwards from the temples. His skin seemed to be pulled backwards from the nose. There was something very slightly odd about him, but it was difficult to say what it was. Perhaps it was that his eyes didn't seem to blink often enough, and when you talked to him for any length of time, your eyes began involuntarily to water on his behalf. Perhaps it was that he smiled slightly too broadly and gave people the unnerving impression that he was about to go for their neck. He struck most of the friends he had made on Earth as an eccentric, but a harmless one, an unruly boozer with some oddish habits. For instance, he would often gate crash university parties, get badly drunk, and start making fun of any astrophysicist he could find till he got thrown out. Sometimes he would get seized with oddly distracted moods and stare into the sky as if hypnotized until someone asked him what he was doing. Then he would start guiltily for a moment, relax and grin. Maybe this would be stare, but not start, never mind. Oh, just looking for a flying saucer, he would joke, and everyone would laugh and ask him what sort of flying saucer he was looking for. Green ones, he would reply with a wicked grin, laugh wildly for a moment, and then suddenly lunge for the nearest bar and buy an enormous round of drinks. Evenings like this usually ended badly. Ford would get out of his skull on whiskey, huddle in a corner with some girl and explain to her in slurred phrases that honestly the color of the flying saucers didn't matter that much really. Thereafter, staggering semi-paralytic down the night streets, he would often ask passing policemen if they knew the way to Betelgeuse. The policeman would usually say something like, "Don't you think it's about time you went off home, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby, I'm trying to," is what Ford invariably replied on these occasions. In fact, what he was really looking for when he stared distractedly into the sky was any kind of flying saucer at all. The reason he said green was that green was traditional space livery of the Beetlejuice training scouts. Ford Prefect was desperate that any flying saucer at all would arrive soon because 15 years was a long time to get stranded anywhere, particularly somewhere as mind-bogglingly dull as the Earth. Ford wished that a flying saucer would arrive soon because he knew how to flag flying saucers down and get lifts from them. He knew how to see the marvels of the universe for less than 30 Altairian dollars a day. In fact, Ford Prefect was a roving researcher for that wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Human beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled in a steady routine. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching in the mud, making occasional demands to his lawyer, his mother, or a good book. It was Mr. Prosser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with occasional new ploy such as the for the public good talk or the March of Progress talk. They knocked my house down once, never looked back talk, and various other casualties and threats. And it was the bulldozer drivers accepted role to sit around drinking coffee and experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial advantage. The earth moved slowly in its diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out the mud that Arthur lay in. A shadow moved across him again. "Hello, Arthur," said the shadow. Arthur looked up and, squinting into the sun, was startled to see the Ford Prefect standing above him. "Ford! Hello, how are you?" "Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Well, I've just got all these bulldozers and things to lie in front of because they'll knock my house down if I don't. But other than that, well, no, not especially. Why?" They don't have sarcasm on Beetlejuice, and Ford Prefect often failed to notice it unless he was concentrating. He said, "Good. Is there anywhere we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur Dent. For a few seconds Ford seemed to ignore him and stared fixedly into the sky like a rabbit trying to get run over by a car. Then suddenly he squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said urgently. "Fine," said Arthur. "Talk." "And drink," said Ford. "It's vitally important that we talk and drink. Now. We'll go to the pub in the village." He looked in the sky again, nervous, expectant. "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed at Prosser. "That man wants to knock my house down." Ford glanced at him, puzzled. "Well, he can do it while you're away, can't he?" he asked. "But I don't want him to do it." "Ah, look, what's the matter with you, Ford?" said Arthur. Nothing's the matter. Listen to me. I've got to tell you the most important thing you've ever heard. I've got to tell you now, and I'm going to tell you in the saloon bar of the Horse and Groom." "But why?" "Because you're going to need a very stiff drink." Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find his will beginning to weaken. He didn't realize that it was because of an old drinking game that Ford learned to play in the hyperspace ports that served the Mandranite mining belts in the star system of Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth game called Indian Wrestling, and was played like this. Two contestants would sit either side of a table, with a glass in front of each of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of Jenks spirit, as immortalized in that ancient Orion mining song, "Oh, don't give me none more of that old Jenks spirit. No, don't you give me none more of that old Jenks spirit. For my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will frown, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that sinful old Jenks spirit?" Each of the two contestants would then concentrate their will on their bottle and attempt to tip it and pour spirit into the glass of his opponent, who would then have to drink it. The bottle would then be refilled. The game would be played again and again. Once you started to lose, you would probably keep losing, because one of the effects of Jenks spirit is to depress telepsychic power. As soon as a predetermined quantity had been consumed, the final loser would have to perform a forfeit, which was usually obscenely biological. Ford Prefect usually played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the Horse and Groom after all. "But what about my house?" he asked plaintively. Ford looked across to Mr. Prosser and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. He wants to knock down your house? Yes, he wants to build, and he can't because you're lying in front of this bulldozer? Yes, and I'm sure we can come to some arrangement, said Ford. Excuse me, he shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with a spokesman for the bulldozer drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent consisted a mental health hazard and how much they should get paid if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to see that Arthur had company. Yes, hello, he called. Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet? Can we for the moment, called Ford, assume that he hasn't? Well, sighed Mr. Prosser. And can we also assume, said Ford, that he's going to be staying here all day? So all your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing? Could be. Well, if you're resigned to doing that anyway, you don't actually need him to lie in here all the time, do you? What? You don't, said Ford patiently. Actually, need him here. Mr. Prosser thought about this. Well, no, not as such, he said. Not exactly need. Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. Ford said, so if you would just like to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could slip off down to the pub for half an hour. How does that sound? Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly potty. That sounds perfectly reasonable, he said in a reassuring tone of voice, wondering who he was trying to reassure. And if you want to pop off for a quick one yourself later on, said Ford, we can always cover for you in return. Thank you very much, said Mr. Prosser, who no longer knew how to play this at all. Thank you very much, yes, that's very kind. He frowned and smiled and tried to do both at once, failed, grasped hold of his forehead and rolled it fitfully round the top of his head. He could only assume that he had just won. So continued Ford Prefect, if you would just like to come over here and lie down. Sorry. What? Said Mr. Prosser. Ah, I'm sorry, said Ford. Perhaps I hadn't made myself fully clear. Somebody's got to lie in front of the bulldozers, haven't they? Or there won't be anything to stop them driving into Mr. Dent's house, will there? What? Said Mr. Prosser again. It's very simple, said Ford. My client, Mr. Dent, says that he will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come and take over from him. What are you talking about? Said Arthur, but Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. You want me, said Prosser, spelling out this new thought to himself, to come and lie there? Yes. In front of the bulldozer? Yes. Instead of Mr. Dent? Yes. In the mud? In, as you say, the mud. As soon as Mr. Prosser realized that he was substantially the loser after all, it was as if a weight lifted itself off his shoulders. This was more like the world as he knew it, he cited. In return for which you will take Mr. Dent with you down to the pub? That's it, said Ford. That's it, exactly. Mr. Prosser took a few nervous steps forward and stopped. Promise? He said. Promise, said Ford. He turned to Arthur. Come on, he said to him. Get up and let the man lie down. Arthur stood up, feeling as he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Prosser, who sadly, awkwardly sat down in the mud. He felt that his whole life was some kind of dream, and he sometimes wondered whose it was and whether they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself around his bottom and his arms and oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely. And no sneaky knocking Mr. Dent's house down while he's away, all right, he said. The mere thought, growled Mr. Prosser, hadn't even begun to speculate, he continued, settling himself back, about the merest possibility of crossing my mind. He saw the bulldozer driver union representative approaching and let his head sink back and close his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving that he did not now constitute a mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noises, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened when he felt miserable or put upon, and he had never been able to explain it to himself. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, the mighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids. Bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in mud, indecipherable strangers handing out inexplicable humiliation, and an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day. What a day. Ford Prefect knew that it didn't matter a pair of dingo's kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not now. Arthur remained very worried. But can we trust him? She said. Myself, I'd trust him to the end of the earth, said Ford. Oh yeah, said Arthur. And how far's that? About 12 minutes away, said Ford. Come on, I need a drink. And that's end of chapter 1. Here is chapter 2. So what we gathered so far is that poor Arthur is living in a house that is near a highway, right? And they want to demolish it for a bypass. And there is an alien for Prefect that is researching for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he obviously found out that the Earth is ending in 12 minutes. And wanted to, I guess, save Arthur, because Arthur is one of his rare friends. And there was a whole comedy sketch about how that alien has convinced the how would I say, the foreman of the work for demolishing Arthur house to switch with Arthur in the protests and see. So Ford and Arthur could go and have a drink. What the fuck? Okay. Should we read another chapter? Should we read another chapter? Or should we leave it for tomorrow? Should we read a chapter a day? How many chapters are there? Are the chapters... oh no, 21, 30... No, the chapters are per story. Okay, so that's too long. I think I'll call it a day for now. Only an hour, a little less, 45 minutes, one chapter and an interlude, because since it's the first, I was kind of tired today, but never mind that. Since it's the first, I will try to listen to this, see what I can improve, maybe add some color to the voice probably. Try to check with plugins if I can alter my voice or something for a particular role. I mean an actor or a participant of the book. So yeah, and I need to check how was the music with all of this. I don't know if anyone joined. I hope you liked it. I don't know how it sounded. God damn, it's hot. I will make some more drinky and I don't know, we'll see. Maybe we'll read another chapter. I don't know. Need more water. Be right back. Something like this. Okay, back from the record. I checked and we can read 2 more chapters. Next chapter is really actually short. And yeah, so why not? Let's do it again. Let's continue. Yes? No? Chapter 2. Here's what the Encyclopedia Galactica has to say about alcohol. It says that alcohol is a colorless volatile liquid formed by the fermentation of sugars and also notes its intoxicating effect on certain carbon-based life forms. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy also mentions alcohol. It says that the best drink in existence is the Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster. It says that the effect of drinking a Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster is like having your brain smashed out by a slice of lemon wrapped around a large gold brick. The guide also tells you on which planets of the best Pan-Galactic Gargle Blasters are made, how much you can expect to pay for one, and what voluntary organization exists to help you rehabilitate afterwards. The guide even tells you how you can mix one yourself. Take the juice from one bottle of the old jank spirit, it says. Pour into it 1 measure of water from the seas of Santreginus 5. Oh, that's Santreginus sea water, it says. Oh, those Santreginus fish. Allow 3 cubes of Arcturan Megagin to melt into the mixture. It must be properly iced or the benzene is lost. Allow 4 liters of falling marsh gas to bubble through it, in memory of all those happy bikers who have died of pleasure in the marshes of Phalia. Over the back of a silver spoon float a measure of qualantic hypermint extract, redolent of all of the hearty odors of the dark qualantine zones, subtle, sweet and mystic. Drop in the tooth of an Algolian sun tiger. Watch it dissolve, spreading the fires of the Algolian suns deep into the heart of the drink. Sprinkle Zempfur. Add an olive. Drink, but very carefully. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sells rather better than the Encyclopedia Galactica. 6 pints of bitter, said Ford Prefect to the barman of the Horse and Groom. And quickly, please, the world's about to end. The barman of the Horse and Groom didn't deserve this sort of treatment. He was a dignified old man. He pushed his glasses up his nose and blinked at Ford Prefect. Ford ignored him and stared out the window, so the barman looked instead at Arthur, who shrugged helplessly and said nothing. So the barman said, "Oh yes, sir, nice weather for it," and started pulling pins. He tried again. "Going to watch the match this afternoon then?" Ford glanced round at him. No point, he said, and looked back out the window. "What's that? Foregone conclusion then, you reckon, sir?" said the barman. "Arsenal without a chance?" No, said Ford. "It's just that the world's about to end. "Oh, yes, sir, so you said the barman, looking over his glasses, this time at Arthur. "Lucky escape for Arsenal if he did." Ford looked back at him, genuinely surprised. "No, not really," he said. He frowned. The barman breathed in heavily. "There you are, sir, 6 pence," he said. Arthur smiled at him vainly and shrugged again. He turned and smiled vainly at the rest of the pub, just in case any of them had heard what was going on. None of them had, and none of them could understand what he was smiling at them for. A man sitting next to Ford at the bar looked at the 2 men, looked at the 6 pin, did a swift burst of mental arithmetic, arrived at an answer he liked, and grinned a stupid, hopeful grin at them. "Get off," said Ford. "They're ours," giving him a look that would have made an Algolian sun tiger get on with what it was doing. Ford slapped a 5-pound note on the bar. He said, "Keep the change." "What, from a $5? "Thank you, sir. You've got 10 minutes left to spend it." The barman decided simply to walk away for a bit. "Ford," said Arthur, "would you please tell me what the hell is going on?" "Drink up," said Ford. "You got 3 pins to get through." "3 pins?" said Arthur. "At lunchtime?" The man next to Ford grinned and nodded happily. Ford ignored him. He said, "Time is an illusion. Lunchtime doubly so." "Very deep," said Arthur. "You should send that into the Reader's Digest. They got a page for people like you." "Drink up." "Why 3 pins all of a sudden?" "Muscle relaxant, you'll need it." "Muscle relaxant?" "Muscle relaxant." Arthur stared into his beer. Did I do anything wrong today? He said. Or has the world always been like this and I've been too wrapped up in myself to notice? Alright, said Ford. I'll try to explain. How long have we known each other? How long? Arthur thought. About 5 years, maybe 6, he said. Most of it seemed to make some kind of sense at the time. Alright, said Ford. How would you react if I said that I'm not from Guildford after all, but from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Beetlejuice? Arthur shrugged in a so sort of way. I don't know, he said, taking a pull of beer. Why do you think it's the sort of thing you're likely to say? Ford gave up. It really wasn't worth bothering at the moment. What with the world being about to end, he just said, drink up. He added perfectly factually, the world's about to end. Arthur gave the rest of the pub another wan smile. The rest of the pub frowned at him. A man waved at him to stop smiling at him and mind his own business. This must be Thursday, said Arthur to himself, sinking low over his beer. I never could get the hang of Thursdays. So that's chapter 2. They entered the bar. We got acquainted with a drink that destroys your mind and you have to recover after that. Okay, let's continue. Drink a little bit water. Chapter 3. On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly throughout the ionosphere many miles above the surface of the planet. Several somethings, in fact, several dozen huge yellow chunky slab-like somethings, huge as office blocks, silent as birds. They soared with ease, basking in electromagnetic rays from the star Sol, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious of their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow something went unnoticed at Goonhilly. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip. Woomera and Jodrell Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity because it was exactly the sort of thing they'd been looking for all these years. The only place they registered at all was on a small black device called a Sub-Eta Sensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness inside a leather satchel which Ford Prefect habitually wore slung around his neck. The contents of Ford Prefect's satchel were quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which is why he always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-eared scripts for plays he pretended. He pretended he was auditioning for stuffed in the top. Besides the Sub-Eta Sensomatic and the scripts, he had an electronic thumb, a short squat black rod, smooth and met with a couple of flat switches and dials at one end. He also had a device that looked rather like a largish electronic calculator. This had about 100 tiny flat press buttons and a screen about 4 inches square on which any of a million pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this was one of the reasons why the snug plastic cover it fitted into had the words "Don't Panic" printed on it in large friendly letters. The other reason was that this device was in fact the most remarkable of all books ever to come out of the great publishing corporation of Ursa Minor, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason why it was published in the form of a micro-sub-meson electronic component is that if it were printed in normal book form, an interstellar Hitchhiker world requires several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around in. Beneath that Ford Prefect's satchel were a few ballpoints, a notepad, and a largish bath towel from Marks & Spencer. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partially, it has great practical value. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moons of Jagland Beta. You can lie on it on the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of Asantraginus 5, inhaling the BDC vapors. You can sleep underneath beneath the stars which shine so redly on the desert world of Kakrafoon. Use it to sail a mini-raft down the slow, heavy river Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it round your head to ward off noxious fumes or avoid the gaze of the ravenous bug-blighter beast of Thrall. A mind-boggling stupid animal. It assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. Deft as a brush, but very, very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal. And of course, dry yourself off with it if it still seems to be clean enough. More importantly, a towel has immense psychological value. For some reason, if a strag non-hitchhiker, if a strag discovers that a hitchhiker has his towel with him, he will automatically assume that he is also in possession of a toothbrush, washcloth, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, map, ball of string, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc. etc. Furthermore, the strag will then happily lend the hitchhiker any of these or a dozen other items that the hitchhiker might accidentally have lost. What the strag will think is that any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slam it, struggle against terrible odds, win through and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence a phrase that has passed into hitchhiking slang, as in, hey, you says that Hoopy Ford prefect, there's a fruit who really know where his towel is. Says, no, be aware of meat, have sex with Hoppy, really together guy, fruit, really amazingly together. So, let's read it again. Hey, you says that Hoopy Ford prefect, there's a fruit who really knows where his towel is. So, nestling quietly on top of the towel in Ford Prefect's satchel, the sub-Eta Sensomatic began to wink more quickly. Miles above the surface of the planet, the huge yellow somethings began to fan out. At Yodril Bank, someone decided it was time for a nice relaxing cup of tea. You got a towel with you, said Ford suddenly to Arthur. Arthur, struggling through his third pint, looked round at him. Why? What? No, should I have? He had given up being surprised. There didn't seem to be any point any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. Drink up, he urged. At that moment, the dull sound of a rumbling crashing from outside filtered through the low murmur of the pub. Through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford hiccuping over the whiskey Ford had eventually bought him. Arthur choked on his beer. Leaped to his feet. What's that? He yelped. Don't worry, said Ford. They haven't started yet. Thank God for that, said Arthur, and relaxed. It's probably just your house being knocked down, said Ford, downing his last pint. What? Shouted Arthur. Suddenly Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly around him and ran to the window. My God, they are! They're knocking my house down! What the hell I'm doing in the pub, Ford? It hardly makes any difference at this stage, said Ford. Let them have their fun. Fun? Yelled Arthur. Fun? He quickly checked out the window again that they were talking about the same thing. Damn, they're fun, he hooted, and ran out the pub furiously waving a nearly empty beer glass. He made no friends at all in the pub that lunchtime. Stop, you vandals, you homewreckers, bawled Arthur. You half-crazed Visigoths, stop, will you? Ford would have to go after him. Turning quickly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. There you are, sir, said the barman, slapping the packets on the bar. 28 pence, if you'd be so kind. Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another £5 note and told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it and then looked at Ford. He suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand because no one on Earth had ever experienced before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny subliminal signal. This signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that being is from the place of his birth. On Earth, it is never possible to be farther than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which really isn't very far, so such signals are too minute to be noticed. Ford Prefect was at this moment under great stress, and he was born 600 light years away in the near vicinity of Betelgeuse. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Prefect with a new sense of respect, almost awe. Are you serious, sir? He said in a small whisper which had the effect of silencing the pub. You think the world's going to end? Yes, said Ford. But this afternoon? Ford had recovered himself. He was at his flippest. Yes, he said gaily. In less than 2 minutes, I would estimate. The barman couldn't believe this conversation he was having, but he couldn't believe the sensation he had just had either. Isn't there anything we can do about it then? He said. No, nothing, said Ford, stuffing the peanuts into his pocket. Someone in the hushed bar suddenly laughed raucously at how stupid everyone had become. The man sitting next to Ford was a bit sozzled by now. His eyes weaved their way up to Ford. I thought, he said, that if the world was going to end, we weren't meant to lie down or put a paper bag over our head or something. If you like, yes, said Ford. That's what they told us in the army, said the man, and his eyes began the long trek backwards toward his whiskey. Will that help? Asked the barman. No, said Ford, and gave him a friendly smile. Excuse me, he said, I've got to go, with a wave he left. The pub was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassingly enough, the man with the raucous laugh did it again. The girl he had dragged along to the pub with him had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour, and it would probably have been a great satisfaction to her to know that in a minute and a half or so he would suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when the moment came, she would be too busy evaporating herself to notice it. The barman cleared his throat. He heard himself say, "Last orders, please." The huge yellow machines began to sink downward and to move faster. Ford knew they were there. This wasn't the way he had wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become. He didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice the sudden irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozers crawling over the rubble that had been his home. You barbarians, he yelled. I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I'll have you hung, drawn, and quartered, and whipped, and boiled, until you've had enough. Ford was running after him very fast. Very, very fast. And then I will do it again, yelled Arthur. And when I've finished, I will take all the little bits and I will jump on them. Arthur didn't notice that the man was running from the bulldozers. He didn't notice that Mr. Prosser was staring hectically into the sky. What Mr. Prosser had noticed was that huge yellow somethings were screaming through the clouds. Impossibly huge yellow somethings. And I will carry on jumping on them, yelled Arthur, still running, until I get blisters, or I can think of anything even more unpleasant to do. And then... Arthur tripped and fell headlong, rolled and landed flat on his back. At last he noticed that something was going on. His finger shot upwards. What the hell was that? He shrieked. Whatever it was raced across the sky in its monstrous yellowness, tore the sky apart with mind-boggling noise, and leaped off into the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut behind it with a bang that drove your ears 6 feet into your skull. Another one followed and did exactly the same thing, only louder. It's difficult to say exactly what the people on the surface of the planet were doing now, because they didn't really know what they were doing themselves. None of it made a lot of sense. Running into houses, running out of houses, howling noiselessly at the noise. All around the world, city streets exploded with people. Cars skidded into each other as the noise fell on them, and then rolled off like a tidal wave over hills and valleys, deserts and oceans, seeming to flatten everything it hit. Only one man stood and watched the sky, stood with terrible sadness in his eyes and rubber bangs in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening and had known ever since his sub-eta sensomatic had started winking in the dead of night beside his pillow and waked him with a start. It was what he had waited for all these years, but when he had deciphered the signal pattern sitting alone in his small dark room, a coldness had gripped him and squeezed his heart. Of all the races in all the galaxy he would have come and said a big hello to planet Earth, he thought, didn't it just have to be the Vogons? The Vogons. Sorry. Still, he knew what he had to do. As the Vogons' craft screamed through the air high above him, he opened his satchel. He threw away a copy of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. He threw away a copy of Godspell. He wouldn't need them where he was going. Everything was ready, everything was prepared. He knew where his towel was. A sudden silence hit the earth. If anything, it was worse than the noise. For a while, nothing happened. The great ships hung motionless in the sky, over every nation on earth. Motionless they hung, huge, heavy, steady in the sky, a blasphemy against nature. Many people went straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. These ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. And still nothing happened. Then there was a slight whisper. A sudden spacious whisper of open ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, every television, every cassette recorder, every woofer, every tweeter, every mid-range driver in the world quietly turned itself on. Every tin can, every dustbin, every window, every car, every wine glass, every sheet of rusty metal became activated as an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the Earth passed away, it was going to be treated to the very ultimate in sound reproduction, the greatest public address system ever built. But there was no concert, no music, no fanfare, just a simple message. People of Earth, your attention please, a voice said, and it was wonderful. Wonderful, perfect quadraphonic sound with distortion level so low as to make a brave man weep. This is prosthetic Vogon Jelts of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council. The voice continued. As you will no doubt be aware, the plans for development of the outlying regions of the galaxy require the building of a bispatial express route through your star system, and regrettably your planet is on one of those scheduled for demolition. The process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth minutes. Thank you. The PA died away. Uncomprehending terror settled on the watching people of Earth. The terror moved slowly through the gathered crowds as if they were iron filings on a sheet of board and a magnet was moving beneath them. Panic sprouted again, desperate fleeting panic, but there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned on their PA again. It said, "There's no point in acting all surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display in your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years, so you had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaint, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now." The PA fell silent again, and its echo drifted across the land. The huge ships turned slowly in the sky with easy power. On the underside of each a hatchway opened, an empty black square. By this time, somebody somewhere must have manned a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcast a message back to the Vogon ships to plead on behalf of the planet. Nobody ever heard what they said, they only heard the reply. The PA slammed back into life again. The voice was annoyed. It said, "What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centauri? For heaven's sake, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know. I'm sorry, but if you can't be bothered to take an interest in local affairs, that's your own lookout. Energize the demolition beams." Light poured out of the hatchways. "I don't know," said the voice in the PA. "A fatigue bloody planet? I have no sympathy at all." It cut off. There was a terrible ghastly silence. There was a terrible ghastly noise. There was a terrible ghastly silence. The Vogon constructor fleet coasted away into the inky starry void. End of chapter 3. And this time I think we'll definitely finish it. Because I think I won't read it like this anymore. I think I will have to read it like, I don't know, probably like something like this. And for that we will change our cameras, probably, you know. Maybe will be differently turned. We shall see. So, in this chapter, the Vogons came, apparently. And, yeah, like I guess we all knew. I mean, whoever looked at the movie is great. The Interplanetary Council is kind of a dick and destroying Earth for a bypass. So, yeah. That's it, mostly. Thank you for joining, listening, or watching this on YouTube. I don't know, we'll see. This is it for now. I am off to take a little break and maybe later, I don't know, play music or play games. You can send me a message if you know me, what do you want, we'll see. Thanks once again. This was relatively fun for me actually, because oh, the book is the book is good. I know the book is good. It can be bad because it's weird and it's like funny. So yeah. bye. Pedro says bye. Don't panic. And see you soon, probably. Or tomorrow, if not soon. Soon. Bye bye.